Afternoon, welcome. It's June 29th, Thursday afternoon, time for THCB gang. I have a group of my old reliables with me, looking forward to a conversation about what is hot in healthcare and close to healthcare and around healthcare over the last week or so. I have Jeff Goldsmith from Health Futures Inc., futurist. Michael Millenson, patient safety expert from Health Quality Advisors, and medical historian Mike Magee. I just noticed that the PowerPoint is screwed up a bit, and I'll have to fix that for the end. But I'll do it for now. All right, gents, great to see you all. We've been having a bit of fun in the lineup to this. I've noticed a couple of things. We should mention the Supreme Court has, as was being heavily signaled this morning, said that I'm having a senior moment. Educational affirmative action, is now no longer legal at UNC and Harvard. But apparently, it's okay to have a legacy or to give Harvard a couple of million to get your son in. So that's maybe the way that we should encourage poor minorities to now to enter instead. And then the other thing we just noticed was that Ron DeSantis has promised to abolish the IRS, which is probably going to be a very popular move. As Jeff was saying, we can just pay what we want now. Anyway, let's abolish death next. All right, let's just start off. What else have people been looking at? Why don't I start with you, Mike Magee?
Well, I noticed this morning the big story about the corporatization of an anesthesia group. I think it was in Colorado, where as a result of a massive buyout of the anesthesia groups, and I'm sure each individual anesthesiologist received adequate reimbursement, the prices were then immediately raised 30%. And it did make me wonder whether the federal government at some point will get involved in some of these locales where you're basically cornering the market on a subspecialty and then driving up the cost. So I found that kind of interesting. And like you, Matthew, I was watching that decision today. And it's an interesting one in terms of policy and the commentary. And there are arguments on both sides of this in terms of tying this primarily to economics versus the color of one's skin and so forth. But so I do think it's a complex subject, but what is not complicated is that institutions like Dartmouth and Harvard reserve almost half of their seats for legacy candidates. And so in that kind of a situation, this is like, a spit in the ocean in terms of the size of the problem. The problem has been so rigged for so long that it is basically totally unequal. So not an expert in that field, but it seems like this is part of why higher education is in a state of flux right now.
Yeah, and you can't even buy the fencing coach's house for a lot of money and fake your way onto the team now. So I don't know. It's all these avenues have been closed off. Michael.
Well, when I heard what Mike said, it occurred to me that if you're an anesthesia group and you raise the prices 30%, they don't feel it. So that's clearly
5-yard penalty and a loss of down, Michael.
the issue.
That was terrible.
And of course, now we're just going to change the definition of affirmative action. When you take an action like giving Harvard $1 million, they affirm it by giving you a entrance to the university. So it's simply a different redefinition. There are two things to watch in the past week or so. First, of course, is the weather. When we talk about social determinants of health, there's a subtext of policy people that's kind of, we are talking about them, those deprived people. Well, it turns out that oxygen is something that all of us need, and that if you cause pollution to go everywhere, that is a social determinant of health that you cannot escape no matter what your socioeconomic class. So perhaps that will bring, although as I mentioned to some friends in Chicago, we used to have pollution from steel mills, which have all gone out of business. And now from Canada, we're getting organic pollution from the wood burning fires. So that is, I know in California, you would
higher class of pollution. probably cost you more money.
Organic pollution. So I think in California you should all natural. You should appreciate it. Vegetarian. The other thing that I'm watching that's really interesting is the lawsuits against the federal government for the price negotiation on drugs.
Oh,
And what's really interesting about that is a couple of things which folks have not talked about. So when these negotiations were under consideration in Congress and the drug companies were saying, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, the securities analysts who looked at the impact of this were all saying, not so much, doesn't affect the stocks at all, right? So you had the political screaming, and then you had the securities analysts saying, don't worry about it. Then it passed. And remember, this was not an executive order. This was a congressional action, right? And now that gave the authority to the executive act. And now you have, after a delay, you have a couple of drug companies which decide that this is terrible enough, presumably because it's the nose under the camel's tent. You have Merck and Bristol Myers Squibb filing suits. And then just a few days ago, the lobbying group Pharma filed a suit. They got the US Chamber of Commerce. And then to make sure that we all know this isn't about the money, it's about the principle, they also brought in the National Infusion Center Association and the Global Colon Cancer Association in the lawsuits, both of whom, of course, are helpfully supported by pharma. So this is just interesting to me that even though this is not some huge hit that's going to put them out of business, they've decided that perhaps with this Supreme Court being as conservative as it is, that even though it's an act of Congress, they're going to say it's unconstitutional and try to knock it down. So I just thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. We should get into that a little bit because there's some bigger picture issues around drugs that I think are percolating up, and that's certainly one of them. Jeff, what have you been up to? And what have you been looking at?
well, we have the same air quality problem that Michael does, way down here in Virginia. And I can tell you, it's really been kind of sobering. I mean, it looks like a really bad fire, only the really bad fire is 1,000 miles away. So I've been waiting for somebody to propose building a wall, an 80,000 foot wall. So, the bad air can't get in from Canada. I mean, I'm sure we're going to hear from somebody out on the fringes about how to solve this problem.
Thank God it's not from Mexico. That's all.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, when they passed that drug price negotiation thing, the thing I noticed about it was it didn't go into effect until 2026.
Exactly.
Which to me was like a way of conceding that you're basically giving the industry 4 years to figure out how to kill it. So, I mean, I still think, it's there's a substantial free enterprise lobby out there that's like, why not subsidize the drug development costs for the rest of the world and pass it on to Americans? I still think Medicare has an obligation to be a prudent purchaser of health services for all us geezers. And the idea that you can do that with pharmacy benefits management firms, I think, is sort of setting in the West. So it's not obvious what the solution is other than having a Medicare formulary. I mean, it's so bloody obvious.
10 drugs, right? 10 drugs in 2026.
Yeah, 10 drugs in 2026. So, and again, there were all sorts of carve outs for this and that. I mean, we can't do simple to save our lives, and we can't say no to save our lives. Other than those two things, we have no problems in health policy whatsoever.
But you guys weren't surprised, were you, that this went to the courts, right? I mean,
yeah, I was a little surprised.
Well, I mean, they've been watching Trump in action for years now, and it's been quite effective. Plus, you got a fairly receptive judiciary at the moment. So I would be surprised if pharma hadn't at least played this card.
Well, let me interrupt. Say
they filed in Texas. You're right, Mike. They did file it in Texas.
Well, of course, East Texas place or West Texas, but there is an underlying issue, right? Which is that, I mean, I think I'll get these numbers wrong, but it's ballpark that Humira, which is finally after 7-8 years of fighting off a sort of a generic equivalent after the patent's expired is finally getting a generic equivalent. And Mark Cuban's cost plus drug company is going to probably make it much cheaper than the equivalent. And I forget how they're manufacturing it, but they're not doing the generic equivalent. I think that I want to say it's not Genentech, it's another Amgen is doing. But if you look at the cost of that, it's a $20 billion drug. A few 100,000 people take it. It's not, Lipitor or one of these mass scale drugs that, that was a blockbuster in the 90s that you're involved with, Mike. And that's the way that drugs are going, right? You have hundreds of these biologics, which are incredibly expensive in the pipeline. Some of them, are millions of dollars for only a few number of patients. And that's kind of where the future of the drug business is going. And then you've now got this revolutionary injectable, which apparently could work for 150 million Americans, those of us who have a bit of a belly or more, Ozempic or Wegovy or Mounjaro or one of the other ones coming out in this flavor, which are, we're talking for these obesity drugs, somewhere in the odds of $10,000 to $12,000 a year. And theoretically, if we believe obesity is a disease, could be taken by, over 100 million people completely, which would be in itself, another doubling, or not quite a doubling, but another 50% on the total bill for healthcare. So I'm wondering, if there is a potential change in the way we're going to start thinking about these drugs, and whether you can do a formula the way they do it in the UK or Australia or somewhere, to think about when you have so many of these different types of drugs which are going to be so expensive, or whether you can now take something like these obesity drugs and say the drug companies may, I assume they run the math and say at the moment haven't yet decided, but might say, the only way to do this is to get this at a level the consumer can pay for, and make this a consumer paid for some of these, make this a consumer paid drug, where if it's going to be, $100, $200 a month, we're going to figure out a way we can make it at that price if we can get enough people to take it, which I think for the obesity drugs we might do. I like to speculate. I love you guys to speculate a bit about where you think this is heading, because we could do a national formulary, but I don't know what that means either for the sort of the 300 biologics in production, or for these incredibly expensive drugs which potentially could go for lots of people.
Well, there's a lot of legal scaffolding that is in place, and it's been there since Bayh-Dole was passed and opened up the federal patents to institutions and their investigators, and carried right through another decade, finally with Lou Lasagna leading the group on behalf of a good cause, which was Solutions for HIV, which was raging, but basically opened up all new pathways for approval of drugs. And there may be 10 pieces of legislation in between those two. So when a pharma, in concert with its government relations partners, decides to go legal, it's because all of those other points of scaffolding are becoming a little weak. And so now it's time to go direct again. And so by directly challenging, and just challenge with one piece of legislation, like you guys were saying, they've got like 10 different lawsuits running at the same time. So clearly what they're trying to do is jam up the system, and they're saying to themselves, who knows who's going to be the next president, and who knows what else might happen. But right now we're taking the heat. And so we're going to jam up the courts with this thing. And at the very least, it's going to buy us some time to figure out how to get out from underneath the pressure of price control.
Well, and how do you factor in the fact that we actually do have a cure for obesity, a surgical cure that probably costs a third as much as the drugs? So how do you make a rational social decision about what's the best allocation of limited resources for folks that are obese and that are clearly going to cost the society money? We've got multiple solutions to this problem. All of them are expensive, but how do you decide? I don't have a clue.
Well, I think one of the things it reminds me a little bit in this case of what happened in Australia, Jeff, when we were fighting for reimbursement of Viagra. There were invasive techniques for erectile dysfunction. You could take a needle in the penis with medication and it worked.
Ouch.
But when we suggested to them that there might be a graphic of all the countries with a pill next to each country's name, and the only one with a syringe next to it would be Australia, Australia folded. And they put Viagra on their list. So,
That's
you know,
fascinating.
a lot of this stuff is a combination of pure PR heavyweight, you know, fighting and government relations on steroids, you know.
Well, I'll tell you, you know, you put I don't know what a bariatric surgery costs these days, but what's the bariatric surgery lobby versus our pharmaceutical industry?
Well,
These
Jeff-
drugs are going to have to be taken
Jeff,
every year. You stop taking them every year, more than that.
Yeah.
You know, you stop taking them and the weight comes back. That's not the case with bariatric surgery. So how do you make a rational decision in an interest group democracy?
Jeff, I think to go back where we started talking about the simplicity, et cetera, or not of our healthcare system, right? What's the grocery store lobby? What's the grocery store lobby that says, you know what, for the price of this, we could cure food deserts, we could do behavioral, some of the pre-diabetes program, as you know, that's offered by the YWCA, that's been approved by Medicare. I don't see a lot of people out there with the YWCA lobby, right? And so,
No.
you know, we have a situation, and certainly the conservatives who come in aren't going to go towards this, where you're looking at a country where we don't have antibiotics and we're short of cancer drugs, and instead we're going to have a drug for people who are overweight.
60
Not
grand a
for
year.
cancer, not for antibiotics, but the invisible hand is going to say, aha, I'd rather develop a drug for people who are overweight. And by the way, we're not going to attack what's causing that, you know, with anything else. And it's just a terrible allocation of resources.
Well, it's 40% of the adult population is obese.
Right.
So there's a very large core group of beneficiaries
right.
who I strongly suspect would like someone else to pay for most of the cost.
Of course.
But I have the two questions, right? One is, you can talk about bariatric surgery, and Roger Agarwal, who hasn't been on much lately, but is a THCB gang member, is a bariatric surgeon. You know, I said to him, how bad do I have to get before I can? And he said, no, you're talking about people with 40 to 45 plus BMI. I mean, these are the most obese. We've defined obesity down to people who, you know, have got a few extra pounds, and it seems to be a little unclear as to how much of that's a medicalization of people who are overweight. However, no question, you know, you look at what's happened to the country and weights and waist sizes over the last 30, 40 years have grown dramatically. A lot of questions about why that is, a lot of questions about diet, a lot of questions about, you know, corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, you know, replacing sugar that they have in Europe. Other countries are also seeing an increase, nothing like what we've seen over here. But I mean, that's sort of the one question, is that how bad is it really? How bad is the impact on health? How much does this create diabetes, you know, cause some of these other problems down the road? So is obesity itself a disease? Is it something, you know? And then the other question is, as Michael said, how are we really going after are we really societally going to go after this? Are we going to change the way we deal with agriculture? I mean, I don't see any way we're going to get there. That seems to be a long way away. So, you know.
Here's another one, and I just saw this afternoon, that we have a cure for hepatitis C, a cure.
Right.
And 1/3 of the adults in the US after 8 years of availability are cured. So we have 2 million people out there with hep C, which is a horrendous illness, destroys the liver. You end up on dialysis. I mean, and it's a one-time. It's not something you have to take every year to keep it away. It's a one-time thing, and we haven't been able to figure out how to get the 2 million people down to zero. So I mean, you know, it's kind of like you want the society to have fingers to kind of pick up a problem like that and take it to a place and fiddle with it and make it go away. We don't have that. We don't have the fingers.
So is the question around Hep C? I mean, because I think you'll have the same thing with obesity. Is like define it. Hep C is a clear medical issue. We have a pill that's expensive, but clearly cures it at a good ROI, given what happens to people with that condition later. Is the problem we can't find the 2 million, or we haven't convinced, or sorry, the 2/3 of them, we haven't convinced them about it. We haven't diagnosed them properly.
Well, there's a whole bunch of them in prison, and the Bureau of Prisons sort of like, I don't know. They've been unwilling or unable due to financial things to give them the drugs. I mean, there's a lot of folks on Medicaid. What is Medicaid policy about the antiviral that kills Hep C? It's probably different in 50 states. It just is one of those things where I just want to run into the closet and scream a little bit and come out, because we just don't know how to do this. And the idea, oh my God, we've got an anti-obesity drug. It's like 50 grand a year for the rest of your life. And of course we've got enough money to do that when 30 million Americans have no health insurance. You by God betcha. So it really is like bad for my blood pressure to think about stuff like this, but it really makes me angry.
So what you don't see, Jeff, and of course I'm in complete agreement with you, what you don't see is the people who hold themselves up as custodians of morality in government uniting around this kind of thing being immoral.
Who are they? Who are those people?
You don't see evangelicals or others, the sanctity of life, right? I mean, look at you don't see people who talk about the sanctity of life coming out and saying, this is killing people, right? Or why are we not making cancer drugs or everything? There's no social solidarity around these kinds of issues, unfortunately.
That's the central problem.
And that is the central issue. It's why, look, England got the National Health Service after World War II because they had been bombed into whatever.
Oblivion.
And everybody was sort of in that same situation, and it went through as that kind of thing. And we passed the Affordable Care Act only after terrible recession and everything. And it's always a matter of us versus them, as you know very well. And when the us feels that us isn't threatened, like the obesity, we're fine with it. When it's them, we as a country do not seem to have a lot of compassion, except around Christmas time, we have a lot of like nice compassionate editorials and everything else like that. So maybe the Hep C people need to be treated all between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and that would work out.
Well, but remember, and this is actually something I'm in the process of writing about. There may be a book here. Is that for 60 years, health policy in the US has been about controlling moral hazard.
Yep.
And it's bifurcated into two camps. There's the doctors are evil, and if we don't do something to restrain them, they will line their pockets camp, which is basically the liberals or progressives. And that ended up giving us HMOs, and ended up giving us, value-based care. I mean, you name it. There's been a long succession.
Nixon, you know that.
Yeah, I know. And then
Nixon was a liberal progressive.
And then on the other side, patients are evil. They don't take care of themselves. And when they do get sick, they expect us to do everything for them. And so we've basically got to figure out a way to make them pay and make them shop for care. And that's sort of the conservative narrative. And that's basically given us 70 million people that have bankruptcy insurance. They don't have health insurance anymore. So we've permitted these two narratives. Either doctors are evil or patients are feckless and immoral to dominate our health policy. And it's given us a set of tools that don't enable us to solve the types of problems that we have just been discussing. I mean, the conservative community looks at those obese people as moral failure. It's their fault that they're fat. Okay? So why should we give them free drugs to get rid of the obesity?
But I agree, but I disagree with an asterisk, because when you have 40% obesity rates, even more in the South, you can't say it's them versus us. So whatever you think, they're your voters. So we're okay with problems that may be caused by people. If there are enough of them who are causing the problem, like, people don't wear motorcycle helmets, right? We don't say, well, you know what, if you choose not to wear a helmet and you have an accident, your health insurance doesn't count because there's enough voters, right? So the obesity, whatever it may be caused morally or not, there's enough voters and politicians who are also obese, if you look at the US Senate, that we're not going to do that, right? So we are only consistent insofar as we pander. So whatever our moral beliefs might be, every member of the US Congress has a deep belief in re-election. And so that's why, if you remember back in the Clinton era, when they were talking about, mothers only getting 24-hour stays in the hospital, right, was terribly dangerous, even though it happened in Europe for years. President Clinton introduced on Mother's Day the Defense of Motherhood Act, or some such name like that, and it passed semi-unanimously because who's against motherhood? So the problem goes back to rationality and morality, we're only consistent in pandering, and that's why, as I said last time you and I were on together, Jeff, Medicaid is recipients, but Medicare beneficiaries. Right. And so and Medicare, I paid for it, just like I paid for all that Social Security, even though, of course, you didn't. And, the Medicaid. So if we had the kind of voting blocks of Medicaid that we have with Medicare, it might cover, but it's just a terrible situation.
Well, I think, Jeff, you're right. There are these two narratives, but the problem, from my point of view, is much more fundamental than that. There simply is no plan. Therefore, there is no list of priorities. There is no discussion or governing body that decides what is best for the country and how to not only make America healthy, but also make all Americans healthy. There's no such body. There never was in this nation. And a lot of this argument over whether doctors are saints or sinners, or whether various different structures are sufficiently capitalistic or moving towards socialistic, to me, is just a distraction. The reality is we have no system to either run care or to establish governance or to decide what's good and what's bad. And as a result, you literally have thousands of different plans, as small as a little Catholic hospital in Idaho, or as large as Cigna with Hartford Healthcare here in the Hartford area. And as long as you have that, we're not going to have people deciding whether or not it's better to have bariatric surgery, or whether it's better to have a medicinal treatment, or whether we even have the proper basic science to understand why people are gaining weight. We to a large extent, we don't even know why this has happened to the nation, unless our whole bias is people are just feeding their faces. But there's probably more to it than that, So I think, the problem is quite basic, and almost you have to start at the beginning with it.
Well, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to the point that you just made, Mike, is that the pandemic really set us back about 10 years to getting towards a sort of a population-based political solution to our healthcare system, because, a very strong libertarian case emerged that public health is somehow a violation of our constitutional rights.
Right.
We have a right to be grossly overweight. We have a right to not be vaccinated and to send our kids to school without measles vaccines. We have, we organize militias to take out governors that advocate, vaccination. It actually goes pretty deep. The pathology that you're talking about here, and it actually, we moved backwards during the pandemic towards what you've talked about, not towards it. It is, to an extent, concern about people's health is, it's a boundary condition. It is an abridgment of liberty. We have a right to make ourselves sick.
Well, as you know, these shocks can send you in one direction or another, right? I mean, I agree with you, both for the educational system and the healthcare system. So far, the shock has been devastating, but it's also been a wake-up call. A similar one that's upon us is global warming, as with the appearance of malaria for the first time in 20 years in both Florida and Texas, which simply is a warning shot that basically says when you change temperature and atmosphere to this extent, the microbe situations that we're presented with will appear novel and will force us to deal with things that could be devastating, and again, would that kind of a shock wake us up and say, hey, we got to have a plan here, we can't go willy-nilly with this thing, or will it just send us deeper into a libertarian hole,
Talk practically about who would do the planning exactly.
Right. Well,
I mean,
the way it's been.
I'd argue that you've got a couple of options. So right now, whether whether it's getting through and all the noise about the new set of indictments for Trump, all this other stuff, Biden is out there talking up the stuff he's done in the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill. He's talking. There is definitely stuff happening as a result of that. The government is, via tax credits and other things, doing things, not in that act, not that even that hasn't yet done the thing it's been sued for by the drug companies. It is doing the other stuff, right? There is now money going into basic infrastructures, money going into renewable energy. You're starting to see, the CHIPS Act has changed where chips and vital infrastructure is going to be helped by the pandemic and helped by the situation with China, of course. We are going to change the way we're going to structure the economy. If you look outside of the US, I'm struck by there's a great group in Australia. I don't recommend it enough to you if I haven't already done so, called Future Crunch, which is a newsletter by these young Australian academics. And they have a newsletter that basically has all the good news, right? And they were explaining about how things have progressed. And they gave it. One of them gave a really interesting TED talk this year, which just came out on YouTube. Essentially talking about the impacts of public health. Now, this has all been outside the US, almost all outside the US and outside the developed world. But in the case of how close we're getting to a malaria vaccine, how things like guinea worm and a bunch of other really appalling diseases that have been in the developing world for many, many years and now been eradicated from multiple different countries, and that we actually have been able to move stuff along. And we used to do that here, right? We did that. We talked enough during the pandemic about the polio vaccine and the things that we did do. And, it seems to me that we have this sort of social confusion and it did set us back a lot. And, we have the Michigan militia running around trying to kidnap the governor because she was insisting on people wearing masks. And I'm with you. But on the other hand, the arc should be that we're moving towards better cures and better understanding. And we should be able to do stuff. Now, I agree there's all these problems. And I also agree that some of the way we're doing this is we're medicalizing all this stuff and making very expensive drugs to be the cures, very expensive procedures to be the cures. And we're not using our sense about how to drive things through the way that Mike's been talking about. But I mean, I'm not convinced that we're hopeless here, but we're looking, but there are certainly big factors kicking against, quote unquote, the right direction. Michael.
So if they were really libertarian, Milton Friedman wrote that the one place where the government should intervene is where there are consequences that go outside the individual's decision. And the so-called libertarians in Congress never talked about, which goes to vaccination, right? So real libertarianism also says that I'm responsible. In other words, if I say I'm not going to do something and it only affects me, then I bear the consequences. So Milton Friedman wrote that if he would not regulate medicine, because if you get your leg cut off and you didn't, and there was something, well, that's affecting you, you'll be a better shopper next time, right? And it'll spread that. The problem is we have faux libertarianism, which says, leave me alone, but if something bad happens, I want the social safety net, I want someone else to pay. The thing that disappointed me, and I've been thinking about this, the political writers, if you read all the op-eds, they're all politically oriented. And they all talk about how during the pandemic, conservative voices didn't speak up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I've been thinking a lot, and I did then, about medical voices. And that when Fauci was being attacked early on, not just now, when things could have been changed, as the guy who caused the pandemic and that kind of thing, the CDC is located in Georgia. Did you have the president of the Georgia Medical Association speak up and say, you know what, I'm deeply conservative for whatever, no taxes, whatever you want, but this is medical and this is wrong? Did you have the president of the Florida or North Carolina or South Carolina? Did you have the people who are the medical establishment of those states speaking up and saying, no, this is a matter of science, not politics? And whether you think that, we should have taxes or not taxes, or universal health care or not, that's not the point here. This is science, and you didn't. And all the time, I think of what Mike wrote in many years ago about neither saints nor sinners. And what you had, unfortunately, deeply unfortunately, is that the physicians who should have spoken up did not have the courage to do so for whatever social reasons. And I think if you'd had the guys with a Southern accent who were their neighbors, who were the medical leaders speaking up in those states and saying, this is ridiculous, right? It would have changed things if you'd done it at the beginning, because these matters of science should not be conservative or liberal. The solutions might be, but you don't have, instead, the only doctors you hear from are the quacks. And then they speak up as if they're representing libertarians and conservatives, as opposed to true conservatives who are also science-based. And I just find that deeply disappointing.
Well, I mean, I think the whole generation of, William F. Buckley, Milton Friedman, libertarian Gothic folks are long gone. And so is that ethos. I mean, we've evolved in a direction where both poles of our political parties, political system are reacting to one another. There aren't a set of fundamental principles that are animating their behavior. And those fundamental principles are the things in which you need to anchor a public health policy. And there's no one speaking up for that.
Well, there's people. I mean, you have Healthy 2000, you have all the rest, but I think it's not equal. You have the libertarian. There's no organization, never has been, but for the pandemic, for certain kinds of things, you could have local leaders of state medical societies and groups like that who would speak up and say, this is for the science. But
we did. I mean, maybe not those people. Maybe, but the people in public health who spoke up. I
understand, but
they were physically threatened. They were doxxed.
Not local.
They were, people threatened to kill their families.
Well, you guys all had in your careers different moments where you had responsibility for physicians, and one of the things about them, and it's true of nurses too, is that these jobs are tough. They're exhausting emotionally and physically, and so there is a tendency when things really get rough to say, I'm leaving the state, or I'm going to go back and be a military this or that, or I'm just going to bail, right? And the job of the leader then is to say, hey, look, this is the job you signed up for. It is a tough job, but that's what you signed up for. And the strange thing is, when you look at the oaths, and Matthew was good enough to publish a piece a week or so ago that I did, where I looked at the actual oaths that doctors and nurses say now and compared them with the values that we see experts, political scientists say are a part of a participatory democracy. They align perfectly, And it made me wonder whether we're positioning these scientists, these doctors and nurses too narrowly, that we're positioning them as science experts when what we ought to be positioning them as practitioners of democracy, because basically they are constantly in the turmoil, in the mix of human beings trying to manage themselves, trying to manage their fear and worry, trying to connect with family members and resources in the community, trying to be hopeful when things seem hopeless. That's what the real job is, and anybody who's led these health professionals knows that we spend a lot of time patting these men and women on the back and saying you can do this and encouraging them, because otherwise it would make sense to just give up and do something else where you can make more money and have, a better night's sleep. So I don't know. I sort of feel like we've got to get these practitioners back in the middle of the mix of making a participatory democracy. And we've got to encourage the hell out of them. And we're not doing it right now. We're basically saying, hey, you want to be a business person? Be a business person. Sell out. That's okay. No big deal. Where we ought to be saying, hey, look, that's not what you signed up to do. You promised that you were going to take care of people day and night, regardless of color. Whatever happens, you'll be there for them. So do it,
Well, there are something like 20 docs in Congress.
Right.
Okay. So, you did have a lot of folks motivated by their concern about the political system to want to run for office, to be I've met some of them, to be, and they're serious people. 18 of the 20, the last time I looked, were Republicans. And a lot of their motivation was to restore a libertarian framework to medicine. And to advocate for patients for sure, but not necessarily for public health. So, you have a couple of Democrats in there. McDermott from Washington was a Democrat. Amy Barra from California is a Democrat. There's a few Democrats in that crowd, but for the most part, the docs that actually got involved in the political system were almost all Republicans, and they were very much. It wasn't exactly. They were sort of pre. The Tea Party generation of Republicans. They were serious folks. They believe in policy. They got their hands dirty on coverage and payment issues. Not gonna take anything away from them as serious public servants. They are, but they had a very different agenda. It wasn't a public health agenda at all.
I agree, and I think to have them involved is fine, but I'm talking about the body politic and the mass of doctors and nurses. Emerson said that for democracy, you need to be Declaration of Independence walking. You got to be in the mix, right? Mm-hmm. You've got to be present, and it's got to stretch throughout an entire nation in a semi-even way. And for better or for worse, that's the workforce that we're working with, right? And we have directed them now and suggested to them that it's okay for them to be just like any other wage earner and go offline and to forget the oaths they've made, Yeah. And I just sort of feel like it's sort of like priests or rabbis, they sign up for a tough job, but they sign up for it. So are they going to do it or they're not? If they're not going to do it, then they ought to get out. Right.
Yeah. I have a slightly different view. I've worked with docs all my life.
Right.
I have a lot of doc friends. I have a lot of docs that I really admire, and I guess my sense of their motivation. I think part of the reason we didn't hear from them in the pandemic was doctors and nurses. There's 6 million of them. We fried them. They were so inundated in the task of saving our lives.
Yeah.
That the ability to, move up 2 levels and talk about the systemic failures or the gaps or whatever.
Right.
It's not that they didn't have a sense that there were a lot of things that could have been done better or differently, or that we maybe needed to approach the problem in a different way. They were just fried.
But that's on us, right?
With them. So,
isn't it on us, Jeff? Shouldn't we have been able to support them better?
Well, yeah, but we didn't. And we were overly, this is something I've been talking about in my talks. We were seriously over dependent on docs of our vintage, people in their 60s and 70s, and nurses in their 60s and 70s. And a lot of them were just like, oh my God, they tried and ran out of gas and quit. And I would have been right with them. They were fried.
Yeah.
And a lot of the younger people that were, that we really needed to take their place, they had no childcare. So, it's like, this concept of readiness that you hear about all the time in the defense community, there's no parallel concept of readiness in medicine.
Yeah.
Nobody's sitting there going, we're not ready for the next pandemic, and here's the things we need to do to fix it.
Yep.
I mean, those could be clinician policymakers. They could be, intelligent lay people, like Ron Wyden, there's a great example, Richard Blumenthal. I mean, there are sophisticated folks in Congress that understand how big a gap there is, but there's not very many of them.
Yeah.
So I'd argue that, we've got two things going on. One is that the decline of sort of respect for institutions as a whole, medicine has been caught up in this dramatically. And that's, and you mentioned priests and rabbis, Mike, obviously, the role of the church. All of these organizations, I mean, pick your favorite, have been either, corporatized or hit by massive scandal. Catholic Church, for example, that's one big example. And you started this this whole session by talking about a group in anesthesiologists who sold out to private equity. We've got those examples of, and Jeff wrote about Envision, the medical group, the Moty group, which was essentially consumed and burnt up by private equity capital. And there are a lot of, I would say that you run into a lot of doctors who are, who are active and socially and politically, who are on the, extreme capitalist end. We just had a quite fascinating. The Justice Department just indicted about 70 individuals for $2 billion worth of fraud.
Telehealth fraud.
Over the pandemic, there's a lot of stuff going on, which clearly is not in the kind of moral Hippocratic oath. We're gonna spread democracy and spread the understanding and spread the sort of social norms that would prevent, or maybe that would counterbalance some of the crazy stuff we've had. So I'm from that end, I worry about it. I see crazy stuff from finance and private equity getting into, and I've been observing it and tracking it and probably cheerleading it too much, getting into various aspects of healthcare. We see like hospice care and what HCA has been criticized for, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me that, we've got a chance to start building some of this back, kind of some of the Biden administration concept of, changing the economy and changing why we think about protecting the middle class and that kind of stuff is in that sort of boat. But we've had 40 years now of I'm all right, Jack, every man for themselves, and it's okay to corporatize and commercialize any aspect of society. And it's going to be really tough to get that back. And, and I go back to what about the 300 drugs, the 300 biologics that are coming down the path that look like, Humira or one of these drugs? Are we going to figure out a way that these things are incredibly expensive and only available to people with really good insurance? And, how's that going to play into a world in which we can't even decide about basic public health? I'm continuing to be I'm concerned about all of this, and I don't see an easy way back. And as Jeff says, we don't seem to have leadership. And Michael's pointing out this too. We don't seem to have leadership in the medical community that does that.
But it's worse than a leadership challenge. It's a structural challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, the question I asked Mike earlier is, where are the fingers? If you were going to say, here are our healthcare priorities, here's the foremost important things that we need to fix. Here's the resource constraints around them, and here's how we're going to solve them. I mean, where does that happen? Anywhere.
Right.
The White House is fighting fires. The CDC is fighting fires. You've got congressional committees that are kind of shackled to the budget cycle, where the only time you can actually do anything is between 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the morning, on the morning that you're pushing out a reconciliation bill. I mean, it seems to me that there's a functional problem, which is that there's no place in a society this vast and complicated and wealthy where all of these decisions come together. And you've got somebody in the White House has a healthcare portfolio, and they get 15 minutes in a staff meeting to talk about it. So I'm like, and even you said, you talked about the National Health Service a minute ago. I mean, 7.4 million people on waiting lists, 13,000 people in hospital that have nowhere to go because inadequate funding of social care. So even there, where you have nominally a social and owned social structure that has responsibility for the health of a population, a combination of starvation of resources and truly mediocre political leadership, and even that system is failing. So I'm like, it's not like we're uniquely, I mean, come on.
No, I definitely agree. And I think you can argue that the sort of lack that I always, Fix Hughes always told me this joke about when John Maynard Keynes took the civil service exam, greatest economist of all time, whatever, he only came second. And so we had such high class, the British had high class civil service, they had a class structure, but they had noblesse oblige. And yes, after the war, everyone came together. We had the National Health Service. You can go, how revolutionary, democratic, and egalitarian was it? You can argue back and forth, but clearly in the last couple of decades, well, post Thatcher, but certainly in the last couple of decades, you've had this similar kind of thing, where everything's got corporatized and privatized, and that sort of social cohesion has fallen apart, which led to
and starved of resources. Don't forget about that part.
Resources, and
right.
Yeah, you've got that now, and the UK is, post Brexit is declining super fast. But I see that there is. All I'm saying is that if you look at global health, global public health, we can see a lot of advances. If you look at various aspects of the American economy, the rhetoric, whether or not the reality has changed, all the private equity and all the stuff that's going on, the rhetoric out of, this week, Biden's been talking about Bidenomics, building from the middle, with the bottom up and the middle out, and getting union jobs into the,
and sending the bill to our grandchildren.
Close enough, right? This stuff is talking about
$1.5 trillion deficit to fund all that stuff.
I agree. And you have to believe you can grow your way out of it. And how much of the deficit came from unnecessary tax cuts under Bush, unnecessary tax cuts under Trump, and the pandemic, which
who cares?
Well, I mean, you can argue back and forth, but
who cares whose fault
it's there. But I mean, you can, if you want to look at the alternative, which is doing the austerity route, that's what happened in the UK. That's why we have starvation of resources, right? They decided after their last recession, they were going to starve themselves out of it, not grow their way out
the difference.
So
the difference with us is we were 40% of the G7 GDP in 1990. We're 58% now.
Yep.
We're kicking the rest of these countries' butts in economic growth. We just have no control over where the proceeds of all that growth go, and no coherent logic about how to spend it.
I agree. All right, quickly, we have 5 minutes, gents. So, Mike, and then we have to do our wrap up.
Real quickly, I think we have to acknowledge that it's not just healthcare, right? So, because we have this right-wing kind of anti-government, take away the money from the IRS, when the logical conservative thing would be, right? Fund the government, the people who aren't paying taxes. If you're law and order, let's enforce tax laws, right? And so, when you look at the infrastructure bill, where it passed with the Republicans all voting no, and now like Tommy Tuberville of Alabama is going to go and for the ribbon cutting, right? So every time I think about people saying, well, what about healthcare? You think about the fact that, remember those bridges that collapsed in Minnesota and elsewhere? When many more Americans commute over bridges every day, right? Then they go into the hospital, people on roads. And if we can't even get the political will to fix roads and bridges when they are collapsing in our very eyes, then, public health planning, right? And the same thing with the pandemic. The reason I know doctors were fried, but I was talking about the leaders of the medical societies to do their job and just speak up with a press release, right? So if we can't even acknowledge reality, right, in a lot of areas, not just in health, then you're not going to get ways to fix it. And unfortunately, I think Liz Cheney had a very good comment the other day that she said that the real problem is we're electing idiots, right? And so if you're electing idiots, well, what do you expect? And so we barely kept some of them out, right? But if you're electing people who will not let reality affect their view of the world, or people who are too scared of their base electorate to let reality affect their votes, well, what do you expect? So it's unfortunately not just healthcare. Like I said, we're going to let our roads and bridges collapse, and then we're going to spend $1 billion with private money, of course, for self-driving cars. And just like you look at the cancer drugs versus obesity. So let me understand this. We have collapsing bridges, but we're going to spend, because the real big problem is that the cars can't drive themselves. And it's just nuts, but that's how we do things here.
Well, I would point out that, and you can argue this is a good democratic back to basics politicking, that I-95, which that bridge which collapsed off, there was a fire, and I don't know if that was because of the truck that collapsed. It got rebuilt in like 2 weeks, And
no, I'm talking about the regular.
I understand, and we are putting money back into infrastructure, as Jeff says, at expense of our grandchildren. And maybe with AI and self-driving cars, we will grow the economy to the point where we can pay back that $1 trillion after we're all dead.
Sure.
Which is the only argument that works for real money. However, I'm with you. It's no, I think the conclusion of this discussion is no one is in charge of allocating the logic and the resources, and we are electing idiots. I will remind you, the Quinnipiac poll done today or yesterday or whatever, that if you run Biden Trump again, Trump wins. Let alone Trump being 50% of the winning 50% of the primary votes. A guy who is now about to get another 35 indictments coming down or whatever. It's remarkable. Well, I think we've got to say this wouldn't have happened in America 50 years ago.
Yeah, I think, though, you have to be quite strategic at this point. Like Jeff was suggesting, kind of in a hole here. And so you got to look for multipliers. And it kind of goes back to Putnam and social capital, where 1 + 1 = 3. That you have to create goodwill between two individuals who are willing to commit to each other, which means in practical terms, who do I know who knows me, whether it's for healthcare or some other service, and who do I trust? That's what the multiplier is. And so you look at a person like Lynn Cheney. She obviously is not my politics, but I know her now. I feel like I know her. I feel like she knows me, and I trust her. And I think she's smart, and I think she's courageous. So why is Lynn Cheney not being put to maximum use? Maybe she is, but I haven't heard about it. But she should be put to maximum use, and all the Lynn Cheneys should be put to maximum use, with the goal not so much to find quick fix technologic or high science solutions, but to reconnect us from a human standpoint, so we trust each other, and 1 and 1 makes 3, and we rebuild what we've lost, whether it's from the pandemic or whether it's from just Reaganism that went stale over a 3-decade period. We got to build it back up. So, it's about human contact and trying to manage ourselves as a species, I think.
Right. And on that minor point of managing ourselves as a species, we're going to have to wrap. So for this episode of THCB, so let's do a quick go around about what people are looking at next. I'll start with you, Michael.
Well, I'm ready to vote for Mike to be president of the American Medical Association, but
sure.
I would urge you to use your voice within running some of what you're talking about for some of the medical journals and other places. I mean, we haven't talked about AI, but AI is continuing to accelerate various proposed uses that may or may not be good uses. And so I've been spending a lot of time looking at what the medical field is doing with AI. One thing that's interesting is they have not yet come to the conclusion that patients can use AI to perhaps choose different doctors, different places to be treated, different treatments, that it's not just going to be doctors educating patients and all the rest. But we'll see. I think it's early days. We're still in the hype cycle, of course, but it'll be really interesting to see how this shakes up some of the inertia in healthcare, or maybe it leads everybody, just who already had a piece of the pie, having a larger piece of the pie. But that's kind of what I'm continuing to look at.
Interesting. Mike.
Well, I'm still thinking, Matthew, when you mentioned the Catholic Church and their loss of trust and so forth, and the loss in general of religion as a social cohesive force in society, I think that's very true and very real. My dad had a office attached to the house and took care of the nuns and took care of the priests, and they're in and out of the house. And what was noticeable about that is that it was a real community. It was an immigrant community, and the people did trust him and they trusted each other. Now, when you lose that trust in a dramatic way, like the church has done, and when you cover it up, that's a hard thing to recover from. But I do think that it's worth thinking about if we're going to build a society from the bottom up here. How do we reinvigorate the capacity, at least, to worship and to try to see the best in each other? Who's going to do that? You know, if it's not going to be the priests and the nuns and the rabbis and the ministers, is it going to be some other kind of job? Who's going to pick that up? Because absent that, I think we're all kind of struggling in the dark a bit. You know, life's tough. And so you need these kind of people whose job it really is to keep us going, you know. And so I think it's worth thinking about that. Where does that workforce come from? I'm sort of suggesting we could kind of reposition doctors and nurses that way. I don't know whether that's really realistic, but if not them, who would that be? You know, so that's what I'm thinking about.
No, that need for community and social cohesion is clearly, especially with the demographic changes we're facing here and across the world, is huge. Jeff, your final word.
Back during the 1970s, Robert Townsend wrote a book called Up the Organization about Avis. And I remember him saying that one of the things that was really great about corporations is the well-managed places had a person who was like a vice president in charge of killing things, getting rid of ideas that don't work, getting rid of divisions that are hopelessly mired in the past or whatever. I honestly think we're having a version of that need now. Ross Douthat had a great article in yesterday's Times about how do you replace an elite, and the theory that our political elites, frankly, both on the left and right, are burned out. They failed us. They not only haven't created valid, believable narratives about what's wrong with our society, but also the solutions to fix those problems. So I'm actually working on a piece about this whole problem of why can't we get rid of ideas that don't work? Why can't we get rid of narratives that are patently self-serving or circular or toxic? We ought to be able to purge these things and move on. And I think a part of the problem is that that power is so entrenched. I mean, Nancy Pelosi at least had the dignity to retire as, leader of the House. We're going to have an election where we have a 77-year-old failed real estate developer who has serious challenges telling the truth against an 80-year-old, pretty good guy who's, trying, but boy, oh boy, that's our choice. So I'm looking for the 40 some odd year old voices to start speaking up and saying we need to approach these problems in a completely fresh way, and we need to be able to figure out how to kill stuff that doesn't work.
Yeah,
I think we could do those two things. I think we'd be miles ahead. And this has been kind of a bummer conversation, but this is a dynamic country. It is capable of solving problems. It is capable of fighting and winning wars. We haven't done that in a while, but I've got a lot of faith in the power of this country to fix things, and it's time to get started.
All right. On that note, well said, Jeff. You have been listening to Jeff Goldsmith from the smoky climes of Virginia, Michael Millenson from the clear air of the lake, not so much today in Chicago, and Mike Magee from Connecticut. That was THCB Gang, quite a large, a philosophical one this week. Next week, we're going to have a large gang, including the Rebitzer twins, Bob, who's a well-known consultant, and his brother Jim, who's a Boston University Business School professor. who've written a book called, this is a small topic instead of the whole world of democracy we've been talking about today. This one will be about their book called Better and Cheaper, which is just focused on can we make the healthcare system better and cheaper. And I just got the book. I look forward to reading it, and we'll talk a bit about it in the gang next week. But with that, thank you very much for watching and or listening. This has been Matthew Holt, THCB founder publisher, signing off and saying for June the 29th, that was the end of the gang today. Thanks very much.